capital.
Banks, capital, biggest banks, biggest banks, capital, higher capital banks, capital requirements, biggest banks, capital requirements, biggest banks, capital, biggest banks, shadow banks, capital, biggest banks, shadow banks, capital requirements, capital, biggest banks, capital requirement, banks, higher capital, biggest banks, capital requirement, banks, higher capital, higher banks, capital requirements, capital requirements, biggest to higher capital, banks, capital, biggest banks, capital requirements, banks, biggest banks,
shadow
capital requirements, capital banks,
banks,
biggest banks, biggest banks,
capital requirements, capital
banks,
higher requirements,
capital banks, higher capital requirements, capital
capital banks,
capital biggest banks are capital banks, capital higher capital requirements, banks higher capital, banks, capital higher capital requirements, banks,
shadow banks,
capital shadow banks, shadow banks, capital shadow banks, capital higher capital banks,
higher
capital higher capital, biggest